talking about a project that we've heard about at some ESHHS meetings already some years ago about automatic writing. And in this case, the title of the paper is Dictated by Thought, Reframings of Automatism in Breton's Surrealism. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Kim, and good morning. This paper explores in a very preliminary way the project of surrealist automatic writing and its reframing of the narratives that had made such automatisms intelligible in the early 20th century. As many of you know, automatic writing had first begun to be widely produced in spiritualist circles in the second half of the 19th century. Women and men in trances wrote out texts they did not consciously compose and that contained information, even forms of language, about which they professed to have no conscious knowledge. Mediumship and the kinds of automatic writing produced in seances were in turn made objects of investigation by philosophers and psychologists, and still later stimulated experiments by poets and painters. If for spiritualists, automatic writing seemed to offer the possibility of communication with the dead, and for psychologists such as Janet and Binet, it promised to reveal something about the structures of normal and pathological consciousness, for poets and artists, it promised a kind of creative spontaneity, unhindered by social conventions and forms of rational judgment. Breton, who had trained as a physician and worked as a medic during the First World War, began experimenting with automatic writing following his release from military service. He and his colleague, poet Philippe Soupeau, decided, as they put it, to blacken some paper with a praiseworthy disdain for what might result from a literary point of view. The texts produced in these first experiments were published as The Magnetic Fields in 1919. The first lines of the first section, The Unsilvered Glass, will give you an indication of the feel of the book. Prisoners of drops of water, we are but everlasting animals. We run about the noiseless towns and the enchanted posters no longer touch us. What's the good of those great fragile fits of enthusiasm, these jaded jumps of joy? 5 years later, in the Manifesto of Surrealism, Breton would designate automatic writing and drawing as the very foundation of the Surrealist movement. Surrealism, he wrote, is pure psychic automatism, by which one proposes to express, either orally, by the written word, or in any other manner, the real functioning of thought. Thought dictated in the absence of all control exerted by reason and outside all aesthetic and moral preoccupations. My interest in Breton is part of a broader interest in the debates, hopes, and anxieties surrounding automatic writing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In other essays, I have focused on the staging of automatic writing, on its sites of production, on the often intensely social nature of the practice, on the play of distraction and attention, and on the management of the marvelous. I've been interested in the ways that this strange practice worked then and helps us now to imagine the self, personality, technologies of communication, and the nature of authorship. Today, I'm bound to think also about the relation of Breton's project to other places where particular dynamics of listening and writing were cultivated, practiced, and commodified, and about the dynamics of power that characterized each of these. These sites might include the French classroom, where since the beginning of the 19th century, the dictée had become a fixture of pedagogical practice, a particular way of demonstrating linguistic competency. Of course, there is also the commercial office, where new technologies of dictation emerged over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These ranged from competing models of taking shorthand, phonographics, stenographics, tachygraphics, to the earliest versions of recording devices such as the dictaphone. Finally, there's the clinical encounter, the broad history of medical interrogation, and more particularly, the kind of listening and writing that marked the relation of psychoanalyst to patient at the turn of the century. In each site, we might ask how listening happens, what is listened for, what it means to listen well, and what is at stake in the relation of listening and textual production. Breton was clear about the stakes for poetics. In a 1933 essay on the automatic message, He argued it was no longer possible, in light of the violent economic and social contradictions of the previous years, to take any interest in much of contemporary literature. He mocked the beautiful and clear composition of poetry and prose that was happy to float on the superficial, conscious level of being. A torrential flow of automatic writing was required, as he put it, to clean out the literary stables. The task, Breton implied, was a difficult one, both politically and practically. Listening and writing well, or in poetically interesting ways, required not only getting beyond aesthetic and other cultural conventions, but as a technical matter, getting consciousness out of the way, disabling the policing function of reason, cultivating a particular relation of the self to the self that made new room for inspiration. As he framed the task in 1924, the goal was for the writer to become a kind of transcription device. We, who have made no effort whatsoever to filter, who in our works have made ourselves into simple receptacles of so many echoes, modest recording instruments who are not mesmerized by the drawings we are making, perhaps we serve an even nobler cause. We'll see in a bit that the metaphor of the modest recording instrument and the passivity it implies is not in the end quite satisfying for Breton or for us, not quite up to the task of grounding a new poetics that brought with it tensions, risks, and even medical dangers. But it is also clear from the beginning that modest recording did not come naturally. Breton characterized taking dictation as requiring a particular kind of preparation, of training and self-discipline that made it possible to learn new habits and unlearn others. Some of his contemporaries used fasting, sleep deprivation, and drugs to help things along. But in the first manifesto of Surrealism, in a section he entitled Secrets of the Magical Art of Surrealism, Breton listed more mundane steps for preparing. Here's a partial list. Put yourself in as passive or receptive a state of mind as you can. Keep reminding yourself that literature is one of the saddest roads that leads to anything. Write quickly, without any preconceived subject, fast enough that you will not remember what you are writing and be tempted to read what you've written. Put your trust in the inexhaustible nature of the murmur. And if silence threatens to settle in, if you should ever happen to make a mistake perhaps due to carelessness, break off without hesitation. It is interesting that others translate une faute d'inattention not as a mistake of carelessness, but as a lapse of inattentiveness. This is at the very least indicative of a play, even a tension between attending and being distracted that weaves throughout Breton's project. Breton advised that such a tension was present the moment the first automatic sentence, which came spontaneously, had been completed. The next sentence, he observed, partakes both of conscious activity and of the other, if one agrees that the fact of having written the first entails a minimum of perception. This, like keeping an eye out for suspicious words, was all part of what he called the Surrealist Game. In the automatic message, Breton focuses on a pair of obstacles, both visualizing what was being listened to and looking at what was being written, threatened to deflect the flow from its original direction. This was a problem, or at least a challenge, that Breton shared with other automatic writers. Many mediums took steps not to look at the scripts they were producing, for example, by burying their heads in the crook of the arm, or by covering the writing hand with a piece of cloth. Looking often slowed or ended the writing, but there were other risks as well. The publisher and medium William Stead did not write well when blindfolded or when his hand was screened from view. But because he was unable to resist looking at what he wrote, this produced what he called the chief defect of his automatic writing. It accounted for the fact that to many of his readers, the voices of the spirits of the dead that he recorded in his writing sounded a lot like the voice of Stead himself. In the psychological laboratory, too, the hand and the arm of the writer were often screened from the writer's view. In Janet's experiments with hysterics, this kind of distraction was often a necessary condition for the production of automatic texts, and the subjects looking threatening to disrupt the experiment. In the case of some patients, screens were not necessary, given that they had a kind of amnesia that meant they were incapable of attending to the writing hand, or even remembering that it was a part of their own body. But for some subjects, practice was required, and Janet engaged in what he described as a kind of training or dressage. States of distraction were in fact cultivated by the scientist so that the doubled consciousness could make itself knowable through writing. Alfred Binet observed in a review of Janet's work that this training raised interesting questions about whether alternate states of consciousness were in fact being uncovered or actually being produced by the habits of distraction taught in the laboratory. In Leon Solomon's and Gertrude Stein's experiments at Harvard in the 1890s, which found that automatic writing was not limited to hysterics but could be learned by anyone, distraction was produced initially by speech, for example, by reading stories aloud while being prompted to write about something else. But after sufficient practice at disciplining attention or getting control of attention, Solomons and Stein found they were themselves able to engage in spontaneous automatic writing. At this point, distraction by reading or being read to was almost unnecessary. Ms. Stein, the authors wrote, found it sufficient distraction often simply to read what her arm wrote, but following 3 or 4 words behind her pencil. When done well, looking at what one had already written could itself serve as the condition of possibility of writing more. It's worth noting that there were also interesting conversations taking place in corporate offices about attention and writing. Shorthand manuals advised their readers to cultivate a state of distraction that made it possible to listen and write quickly and accurately. That kind of absent-mindedness also required repetition to become habitual. As Price and Thirschwell remind us, early typewriters included a bar that hid the typed script from view. Rather than a problem, this was celebrated in early advertisements as enabling the typist's whole attention to be focused instead on the notes she was transcribing. And as the authors note, by the late 20th century, some companies were giving preference to data entry workers who didn't speak the language of the data. The ideal worker becomes a non-reading writer. The side of listening and writing that mattered most materially to Breton was the psychoanalytic encounter. In the Manifesto of Surrealism, Breton thanked Freud for bringing the most important part of our mental world back to light. Dreams and the unconscious constituted a new terrain for poets. The depths of the mind contained strange forces capable of augmenting or even battling against those on the surface. Can't the dream, Breton asked, also be used in solving the fundamental questions of life? More concretely, Breton credited the Freudian methods, which he had occasion to use on some patients during the war, with providing the model for automatic writing. I resolved to obtain from myself what we were trying to obtain from them, namely a monologue spoken as rapidly as possible without any intervention on the part of the critical faculties, a monologue consequently unencumbered by the slightest inhibition and which was as closely as possible akin to spoken thought. For Breton, the turn toward Freud was also a turn away from the psychology of Pierre Janet, though it is clear that Janet's work on psychic automatism had also been important for the development of Surrealism. Indeed, Philippe Soupeau would accuse Breton of failing to acknowledge publicly that the readings and rereadings of Janet's book had forced them to question themselves about poetic creation. Others have analyzed Breton's silence with considerable subtlety, and I won't rehearse the whole argument here. But on one hand, Breton resisted Janet's consistent pathologizing of the capacity to write automatically. Indeed, Janet constituted automatism as a particular kind of medical problem, a form of dissociation that could be treated only by reasserting the dominion of the will, precisely the kind of hierarchical relation that Surrealism proposed to dismantle and prevent. Breton would, by contrast, go so far as to define hysteria itself not as a disease, but as a supreme means of expression. On the other hand, Breton rejected as sterile a whole range of psychological projects, including Janet's, that stripped non-conscious states of their marvelous qualities. Surrealism's project, Breton affirmed, was to work against this hatred of the marvelous. Ironically, even other psychologists who affirmed that the capacity to write automatically was normal, or at least that anyone could be taught to do it, nevertheless found the content of the text that produced automatically to be rather less interesting than Breton did. Solomons and Stein characterized the automatic writing they called forth in their lab as repetitive and not indicative of anything special. The stuff written was grammatical, they observed, and the words and phrases fitted together all right, but there was not much not much connected thought. The ability to write stuff that sounds all right without consciousness hardly matches the poetic ambitions of Breton's manifesto. Breton was more aligned with the work of psychologists who celebrated the creative capacities of their patients, or who saw states such as hypnosis as liberating hidden talents. He also identified Frederick Myers, the author of a series of studies on automatic writing in the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research, as an ally in his project. Myers, who shared with Breton a habit of experimenting on himself, used automatic writing to explore, among other things, the structures that might make telepathy possible. For Myers, automatic writing was neither a pathology nor a sign of life after death, but instead evidenced the extraordinary capacities of the normal brain to perceive thoughts at a distance. Because this consciousness was, in his view, not subsidiary, but substantive and primary, it might be more appropriate to talk not of the subconscious, but of the superconscious. Indeed, it represented for Myers a higher stage of human evolution. We might also frame the contrast among these varied projects in terms of what is listened for. In most of the psychological work, the automatic texts themselves are at best indexical. They point to something else of psychological interest, to an underlying state of dissociation, or to capacities to feel or to attend. It would not be fair to say Genet was completely indifferent to what hysterics wrote, though he rarely reproduced long extracts of their texts. But he was interested chiefly in what the text revealed about the relative autonomy and consistency of different personalities, or about the reach of their limits of knowledge. In some cases, for example, an alternate personality might register a prick of a needle that another was incapable of feeling. Even for Myers, who celebrated the marvelousness of certain states of consciousness, what was said was less important than the means by which it might have arrived, for example, by telepathy. Finally, Breton expressed a kind of admiration for mediums, and especially for the ability of some of these to analyze their feelings while taking dictation. With their help, Breton drew a contrast between the automatism of poets and that of mediums, at least those with what he called outstanding gifts. The latter operated by setting down letters or lines in an almost entirely mechanical fashion. They have absolutely no idea what they are writing or drawing, and their hand is as if anesthetized and guided by someone else's. But if some automatic drawings produced in Breton a sense of wonder, samples of medium-based automatic writing struck him as far less interesting. Breton suggested this was largely the fault of the pathetic spiritualist literature which with they have usually been contaminated from the start. Breton also resisted the medium's effort to dissociate the personality and to locate the dictating element externally. What was needed instead was to unify the personality, whether of the medium or anyone else. By 1930, the date of the second manifesto of Surrealism, Breton was already lamenting the failure of automatic writing to take hold as quickly and as seriously as he might have wished. It is unfortunate, he wrote, that more systematic and sustained efforts have not been made in the sphere of automatic writing and the description of dreams. When texts were published, they aroused little sustained interest or could be regarded and dismissed as virtuoso pieces. Even worse, in some cases, the effects they were meant to produce were disrupted by the appearance of an obvious cliché in the middle of the text. Breton blamed this state of affairs on the rampant carelessness of the vast majority of their authors, who were generally content to let their pens run rampant over the paper without making the least effort to observe what was going on inside themselves. In other cases, though, poetic vanity interfered with the indifference and absent-mindedness that were required to produce authentic texts. And it didn't help that surrealist automatism lent itself so easily to parody. As a result of these and other failures, Breton wrote, the fact is that we still know as little as we ever did about the origin of the voice, which it is everyone's prerogative to hear. It seems that the project of blackening some paper, as Breton had described his early work with Suppot, was not by itself enough. It was also necessary to exercise a kind of care, perhaps to be listening for as well as listening to something, to be on guard for the intrusion of reason or the commonplace. Ironically, a kind of attentiveness was required to remain inattentive, and a kind of self-editing was required to limit the effects of self-editing. And if this complex relation of yielding and attending proved hard to sustain, and in particular to cultivate or reproduce in others, it was also hard to bear. Perhaps in proportion to the inspiration it promised to make visible, taking dictation from thought could also be dangerous. The proximity to dream states, and indeed to madness, that made the poetic stakes worth waging also threatened the mental well-being of the automatist. It was far safer to do this work in the presence of others. The poet's studio is not the only place things were complicated. As others have shown, taking dictation well in other contexts, at the seance table, in the corporate office, in the studies of authors dictating novels to their personal assistants, also required a complex play of listening and interpreting, of absent-mindedness and focused attention, of letting go and holding on. Nowhere, perhaps, were the stakes higher than Breton had made them in what he called the Surrealist Game. But for many of his literary contemporaries, the contradictory rules of that game proved simply too hard to follow. Thank you.
Thanks very much for this, David. Do we have some questions? I mean, I have a lot, so I might start while everyone else is thinking. So I was really interested, I mean, it's a fascinating kind of link with the office and so on, but I'm really interested in the way that it seems to be that the automatic writing comes always from language, like it's language to language, it's not visual or,
Right.
or other senses. So is that something that you can comment on, or that they?
Yeah, I mean, so Breton is interested, and especially in the work of, I mean, there's a kind of analogy he makes with taking dictation and automatic drawing. And for automatic drawing, he calls it sort of stenciling. That there's an image that's present that the automatic drawer follows, and there shouldn't be any sort of aesthetic judgment being made in the midst of the drawing. So he's interested in images, but especially in the case of automatic drawings done by mediums, which are, I mean, one of the reasons he finds them so remarkable is that some of these mediums are able to move a pencil around a paper in an apparently random order, moving from section to section, and an amazing architectural drawing emerges at the end. I mean, he's struck by the marvelousness of that. But in the context of dictation, he thinks images are a problem, and that if you stop to visualize, you're inevitably going to begin to make editorial judgments and aesthetic judgments and other kinds of things. So he's really resistant to letting images come into the mind.
So then it has to be, if you're writing, it has to be language that's coming to you.
Right, and there, again, sort of like, classroom experiences, office experience, like taking dictation has a very particular form in the 19th century that seems to me to be shaping, limiting, enabling the way that he thinks about that kind of work.
Yes, sure.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I can't see you, but I can hear you.
I mean, two-part question. One is, I was wondering, do you know the historian Philippe Artière, who, I was having this kind of association of ideas with kind of history of penmanship, and I mean, he's very kind of Foucauldian and the discipline of the body in terms of penmanship and social class and all these kinds of issues. And I was kind of thinking about to what extent the automatic writing is almost a sort of an anti-dicté, because the dicté, taking dictation, that this is a children's exercise in France, and even adults, there's competitions, and it's always done by Romanians and not French people or Bulgarians. But when you listen to French dictation, the listening is problematic, and it's the listening that's going to distract you from all of these kind of markers of social class and things like this, knowing how to accord the Italianism, how to say. But basically there's all of these silent rules of dictation, because you can't hear something.
Right. Listening can be a trap, right? Yeah. So listening can be a trap in a way.
So the listening is a trap, and it's not the voice of the child, it's the voice of, society and class and things like this that you're listening to. So it seems like it's almost kind of the automatic writing almost as a reaction to this constant discipline that children are taught to become French.
That's a great thank. That's a nice complicating question. As you suggest, I mean, particularly in the 19th century, there's a lot of there are a lot of ways in which handwriting and character and personality are connected or being made to be connected. And one of the striking things about a lot of automatic writing, that's produced by mediums, is its excess. I mean, it is barely legible. It doesn't stay on the page. It's just pure excess. They use enormous sheets of paper, but even still, it just goes off the edge of the paper. And so it too stands in an interesting relation to the sort of disciplining of the body and of penmanship that's happening, across Europe and the US in the 19th century. Interestingly, Breton's writing is much more mannered. It's interesting. I mean, it looks nothing like the writing of mediums, and so. But again, I mean, he thinks I hesitate to say too mechanical, but the writing of mediums that he calls it mechanical, and it's as if their hand is being moved by somebody else. He needs there to be this sort of distracted, but nevertheless somewhat attentive listening going on in order for what's being produced to be interesting. It's maybe not surprising that his writing doesn't look like the writing of mediums, because he thinks it's in some ways unsatisfactory, or that it maybe can't be art, right? But thank you, that's a great question. And Philippe and I go way back.
Great. So we have time for one.
Fascinating. Are there any rules or ideas on the bodily disposition when one has to start or wants to engage in automatic writing? Are there any ideas of how one should be sitting, or are there any?
Yeah, I mean, one of his prescriptions that I didn't read is to find yourself a comfortable chair in a quiet room and that sort of thing. But he also alludes to his own sort of personal tricks for getting the writing started and for resuming it when it stops. But he refuses to name them. He's kind of coy about it. But yes, I think for anybody engaged in automatic, whether it's spiritist writing or in a psychology lab, the disposition of the body is important, not just how it's sitting, but as I've said, what parts of the body you can see and what you can't see, and I mean, one of the first rule that Breton has is sit somewhere quietly and have writing materials brought to you.
Yeah.
which is an interesting sort of, but it's a reminder that often when this stuff is produced, there are other people in the room. I mean, in the laboratory, in the seance, and that's one of the things that interests me is how socially complicated some of these writing practices are.
There's not only a gymnastics, you can have exercise.
I have not seen that. There may be. I mean, because some people, as I said, are fasting. Some people are not sleeping. Some people are taking drugs. So it wouldn't surprise me if some people are moving the body also in other ways to try to get ready.
I think a few conversation where we can do breathing exercise before, or some kind of getting into that state that allows you to improvise.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll look for that. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks again, David.
Thank you.